All right, and again, welcome to everyone that has joined us today. This is a different book, as I was beginning to say, in that it is a narrative. It is an explanation. It is a book of encouragement. And as such, it is kind of a summary. So to summarize a summary becomes a little challenging, but today we're going to approach it and just examine some of the key concepts. This is a book that you read through once and probably read through twice, and to capture those major themes and to have assurance. And sometimes I wonder if he didn't do that as much or anything else to just give a level of confidence that our physical existence may end, will end, no question about it, but that our spiritual essence continues. And that the individual of who we are, again, evolves. And yet there are missions, there's purpose, there's continuation beyond the physical realm. So that's kind of the theme today that we're going to be looking at. And as it's on the screen right now, one of the things that I think is even more important is that as we focus on these studies, that there's these four aspects to consider. The first is that we want to know. Knowledge needs experience. This book is probably one of the best examples of that. Also, to will into knowing what you want. I believe, and I really think that this book infers that not only in our physical realm, but states in our next evolution, that we have a purpose, that there's a meaning to our life, and that there will be clarity as we enter into that, in terms of clarity, in terms of retrospect, being able to look back. That also means that both in this life and the next, that there will be an element of risk, appropriate spiritual risk, so that we can, if you will, stretch ourselves so that we can better be that person we're intended to be. And the one thing that this book doesn't talk about, but there is moments, if not extended periods, of listening, of understanding, of comprehension. So I will greatly encourage you to begin that practice now, because that's one of the things he talks about in the book that I think is so exciting, is that our time now is not just a preparation for the next, as some religions hold, but is the full living of life today in a way that is transformative. And knowing that we carry that transformation that takes place now into the next realm. So it's not wasted. It's not misspent efforts, that we will be an element of change both today and in the future. Now, one thing I was reading this week that I thought was really interesting, I was reading about Cicero, and a quote really jumped out at me. And that he said that satisfaction in life can be found in two sources: a good library and a garden. And I had to kind of step back and think about that a little bit. A good focused library, a library that has the materials that allows you to have reference, to have place, and to have vision. Collecting these is a source not only of inquiry, but of stimulation. That these books, not just the 21 volumes, but all the related books that come to us about Hermetic traditions, about all the different aspects of sacred geometry, of the explorations that we've made in terms of alchemy and other topics that these books have been foundational in discussing. All of these are important in the sense that they can be multi-generational, not just for your benefit, but as an inheritable library passed to that next generation. Now, this generation may or may not be related to you, you may be called upon to donate that library to individuals that can carry forward and be a continuation of your life work. And in doing that, I encourage you to consider printed edition rather than electronic books. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Part of it is my worldview. My worldview is that life runs in cycles, and that we're entering into, and I think many of you also believe this, and Zaid kind of hints at it, we go through life cycles in the history of the country that we live in, or the world that we live in, where things change. What would happen if the internet was no longer available? What would happen if electricity was no longer available? And many might scoff and say, well, that's just not very likely. I think it's a growing possibility and probability, and I'd rather be prepared, because if it doesn't happen, I still have the books. If it does happen, the books become gold. They become part of the repository of knowledge. And remember that societies like ours have existed, I believe, from the beginning of time. Sometimes they're called secret societies. I think they're more just a gathering of those individuals who are knowledge seekers and practices and observers and practitioners of, shall we say, goodness? Shall we say intentionality? Shall we say making a difference not only in their own life, but in the life of the world? And I think that's part of the reason too that he talks about a garden. Having a garden or some form, this does not mean you have to have something elaborate. You can have a window garden. Helps us remember our place in the world. We spent in one book quite a bit of time talking about that humankind is not above nature. It is not below nature. It is a part of nature. And helping us remember that we have a place, that we have a contribution, is really a critical element. So I encourage you to, and I know many of you have already started this, or have a far more extensive library than I do, have intentionality, focus in your library, be a collector of knowledge, so that, again, it can be shared and focused into the future. And then, as a personal grounding effort, continue your involvement with nature. Alchemy, a great deal of understanding of alchemy is also understanding the nature of the world around us. And growing things and understanding the cycles of nature are just reinforcers to that. So just a thought to consider, especially as we're talking about, if you will, what comes next, which is the theme of this book. If we're looking to tuning a dial to the inner planes, what are we really talking about? We're talking about vibratory levels. We're talking about, for us physically here in this plane, being able to begin to have a glimpse of what comes next, but also having a perspective of what needs to be done now. Part of that is understanding that life on the physical plane is about repeating cycles. He states it pretty clearly, but does not explain it. And again, if you look at the traditions of the indigenous peoples, if you look at the traditions found within other world religions, there's a commonality of events, some of it prehistory, pre-6,000 years, that if you start looking to the sciences, you'll begin to understand that there are physical things that occur within our world that repeat. The glaciation of the continents, of hot and cold, wet and dry. All these things run both on short and long-term cycles. So just bear in mind, as you're reading the narrative here that he provides in this first chapter, that don't think of time as linear. Think of time as circular. And that there is a repeating cycle, as even we see the zodiac, of a recurrence in nature and a recurring processes. And that also, I think, speaks to the realm of why we don't practice reincarnation. We practice a advancement and moving forward. And that the essence of who we are in our consciousness survives beyond this physical body and evolves into that next element. Zane talks about quite a bit about what will be some of the characteristics and attributes, not so much about describing a lot of the day-to-day and much of the mundane. It's more about the overall of our experience. But I found it particularly interesting in the Green Book on page 7, for those of you who have the Green Student Book, when he talks about the sources of information. And again, the warning about feeling ESP. And make sure that you really watch and read that carefully and look into this and examine your own life. Feeling ESP is really being manipulated and controlled or driven by your emotions rather than your intellect. We know that we are not our feelings. This is one of the principles of Psychology 101. You're not your feelings because feelings change. You may be happy one minute, sad the next, and then back to happy. So obviously, our essence is much more than our feelings. And it's just really critical that you understand who and what you are. There's also the comparison of the inner plane with Einstein's theory, as elaborated by others as well, theory of relativity, and that was on page 11 and 12. We know, and we're beginning to have scientific insight into fundamental principles of vibratory rates that have been known since prehistory. So to see that where we place ourselves and as we change our vibratory rate, we have many different experiences. We also know, looking at pages 16 and 17, that the inner plane exists on multiple levels. Now, if you're looking at Einstein's theory, sometimes you can use, most of the time, there's an interchangeability between the inner plane and dimensions. So when you read and see the word dimension, utilize the word inner plane, and you'll find that there's a consistency there that may help to clarify some of these topics and bring more meaning in as you read some of the scientific literature. Also understand that there are in astral levels of hierarchy, and we move between those based on our vibratory rate. We have a tremendous amount of control today in terms of our experience. But it takes intentional practice to not be swept by the astral influences, the winds, that, if you will, if I can use that analogy, the winds of astral force, of solar forces, of galactic forces that are constantly influencing the world around us and ourselves. But know that through directed thinking and through alchemy, that we have the ability to change. We have the ability, if you will, to rise above not only these influences, but also gain perspective, which I think is one of the things that he implies, but I did not find that he ever truly stated. Having perspective of a person, place, or thing, even if that person's ourselves, gives us great comfort to know and to be assured that what we are seeing today is not lasting, but more importantly, that we can experience it in a way different than those around us. We do not have to be swept by the spirit of fear. We do not have to be swept away by the thought, or if you will, the experience of there's not enough. We can step back, gain perspective, and rise above it to be and to act in a way that is powerful, that is, and I'll use the word again, transformative, not only to ourselves, but impacts others in a very positive way, in a very influential way. Now, the role of thoughts, perceptions, and desires in chapter 2, page 25 through 39, is really, again, a narrative about all the different things and a review of what thoughts are, the elements of those thoughts, how they move between the physical and the physical plane and the inner plane. Note also that these thoughts build, if you will, meaning. They build almost a structure, if you will. That's maybe another analogy. That the purpose of directed thinking, or shall we say loose thinking, constructs a structure that is either beneficial, practical, and usable, or is much less than that, with weakness. Because not only is the foundation important, but it's also extremely important that the structure built on the foundation is solid, that it is useful, that it is applicable. Our thoughts, our perceptions, our desires formulate these things in the way that he explains in this chapter. It is not something that is aloof. It is not something that cannot be understood. It is very practical, and it is very meaningful. So the more elements, again, that we can take within perspective to understand probably the biases that we've been raised by, particularly if we had a religious upbringing, we may find that those no longer serve us as they did before, that we have moved beyond very limiting expectations and roles, definitions of heaven, of hell, of purgatory, of the many different facets that those all represent. Can you say, and this is a question we'll talk about in the question and answer time, can you say that heaven and hell as such do not exist? And I think it really becomes more of a question of, well, have you created it within your mind? Have you created it within your experience? Have you, in essence, when you see these things and believe these things, have you given it power to become dominant or to become influential in your life? And I think that gets into a whole interesting discussion, that when we talk about individuals who pass into this next realm with a strong religious belief that there is a manifestation, as Zane tells us, a manifestation of what they expect that has to be changed. In pages 39 through 40, we talk about our relationships, those that we have been involved with, both of family and of friends, and how in many sense these do not go away, these do not change, these do not evaporate. They evolve into something, if you will, and change is probably, I should not have used that word. They do evolve into other bases of relationships. One of them we'll talk about in a minute is for those who have been married or in intimate relationships with more than one person. There has to be a resolution as to which person you're going to be with that serves the purpose. And I thought that was a very interesting discussion. Chapter 3, the transition technique. And I really think that this chapter 3 is one of the most important chapters in this book, because it helps you to understand what happens. as you make that transition from the physical to the next realm. And what are the characteristics of that? Oftentimes, we're driven by fear of the unknown. This is to help you and to help me understand that there is a basis of understanding here, that there is a foundation that given that we don't have to be afraid of. On page 46, he actually refers to the transition technique. And death is not accompanied by sleep. We may say then, not because it is common method among physical death, but because the natural evolution of the higher states of consciousness make it spontaneous, that the passing to the next phase of existence in full consciousness is the natural method. That as you move, as you migrate with can migrate with full consciousness, in peace, not in fear. Now, also in pages 50 through 53, he gets into a very detailed analysis of these three concepts of natural birth, accidental birth, and surgical birth. Now, natural birth leaves the body, leaves the physical body voluntarily to make a temporary visit to the astral plane, on which the visit there is always a cord of astral substance connecting the astral body with the physical. This is prior to the death of the physical body. Now, this is also later on, he discusses that the insight that he is communicating was gained as he was able to journey into the inner plane and also others and gain information. Accidental is more abrupt. And this is, for instance, a gentleman or a woman in warfare is the example that he uses, where they are cut down or their life is ended in this physical plane in an accidental way. And it is not something that they had time to prepare for. It is not something that they expected. It was a very sudden event. But being so close as yet to the earth and the activities for which they have been participated, they can see both the astral form of those who have passed from the physical and the astral forms of those yet in the physical, in the astral and the physical. If a horse has just been killed, one of them may jump on its back and ride it without knowing it has passed over. He sees it stumble and fall and then arise. He cannot yet realize that it is only the astral body of the horse that has risen. Now, the reason I read that is that all existence changes and moves between astral and physical. So it's not just humans that also experience this, but also in other life forms, or in the broader sense, everything with life force. So just be aware that particularly in an accidental or an unprepared type of birth and transition from the physical to the inner plane, that there can be, and it often is accompanied by a time of confusion, a time of not knowing, kind of able to separate one layer from the other. Surgical. But before speaking further of the surrounding of this new birth, we should take some consideration of those who pass by means of the surgical method. That is more common method of so-called death. No two deaths, of course, are exactly alike, and therefore no two births on the inner plane. Ordinarily, however, the person who passes out by illness or old age lies in bed. Usually the astral form moves forward and gradually out of the top of the head. Thus the feet and hands become cold first, and then the coldness moves upward to the knees, then the astral body gradually moves out through the head, and the coldness extends throughout the body. Because in such separation, the astral from the physical, the last remnant of connection between the two bodies is in the region of the brain may remain clear to the end. And even when there has been unconsciousness just before the complete departure of that last remnant, The person now occupying the astral form, which hovers over the physical, may visualize the physical brain for a moment to permit one last glance in full consciousness at friends in the flesh, the saying of farewell to dear ones, or the delivery of some last message. Then the cord snaps, and the person is no longer a denizen of the flesh. That's very reassuring, particularly with someone who is transitioning in a way that probably the majority do, that there is a logical progression. If we look on page 58 through 60, when we discuss the conditions of the next life birth, there can be the need, and often is apparently the need for assistance by those who have already passed over, who provide supportive and explanatory roles based upon the condition that the person arrives in. The book explains, I think, very well, and I can well imagine that there is a disorientation, that there is a time we look at and we say, oh my gosh, what has happened? Where am I? And if they are unprepared, or if they are frightened, there is a time for adjustment and assimilation into this new realm. So read 58 through 60 very carefully. Again, it's very reassuring, as all of this. Chapter 4, talking about the astrological influences. Note that in the transition process, there's a separation and adjustment. We just talked about that, and information to our advantage. So the previous astrological influences continue on, but there's implication that new forces are also opportunistic and can be utilized. So what's the road to progress in 79 through 80? We have prior and post-transition events where, again, we start to look, we take the information and the basis of our life experiences, and we can utilize them into understanding and seeing our purpose, which may be a continuation of what we were doing, or it may be something entirely different. And then take those environmental influences of need, of desire, of thought, utilize the power and the strength of those to move us that way. We don't need money. Chapter 5 talks about that. Money, in the sense, or shall we say capital, is more based upon our abilities and our talents. So we deposit, if you will, we build up in this life tasks, talents, abilities that then are a deposit that can be drawn upon in that future time. And we're able then to make utilization of those, again, based upon the needs. And the needs are, I thought, were really interesting. Teachers, astrologers, farmers, and miners, not growing crops, but really cultivating. And you can read about that. Teachers and writers, mechanics and engineers, artists and leaders. All of these discussed in detail on page 93 through 100 help us think about what role might we like? What role is a natural evolution of where we are today? And how that we can benefit not only ourselves, but more benefit the greater community and world that we're participating in. Chapter 6, Education and Progress. There's 3 phases of education on page 106 through 120. And the education is mental, emotional, and spiritual, the 3 phases of education. And there is a substantial information given us in terms of how, for instance, the mental education is accomplished and how we can benefit from that even today before, and as a way of preparing. No less is the emotional, and of course the spiritual. It's kind of interesting in other mystery, or shall we say, esoteric types of hermetic organizations like Freemasonry. Freemasonry focuses, especially prior to initiation into the first degree, on your coming death, to give the person the perspective of saying, what have you done with your life? What will you do with your life? And how can you prepare for the next life? Those are three elements that parallel what Zane is talking about here. And as mentioned before, he reinforces again on page 108 through 109 that there is a period of adjustment. For many, this is particularly disturbing, scary, and, if you will, such a significant change that it is hard to make an adjustment. That is why there are those that are assigned to you to help you transition. Now, it was interesting in the materials as well. If someone held a particular religious belief system of what that teaching had been about the expectations of a heaven or a hell, or a purgatory or something in between, that it often would play out in the first part to they would envision and experience what they thought. However, that would begin to evolve and transition into what it really is. And I encourage you to go back and read these chapters on that, because particularly for your friends and family that may have a certain religious influence, it would be likely that they will see what they expect, that they will experience what they expect. And then they'll begin to evolve into what really is. So our thoughts, again, are very powerful. They dictate our experience, both current and in the future, and follow through that. So chapter 7, Earthbound Souls and Astral Hells. There's some pretty not nice places, even within what's going to come, if we are in a place today that is destructive. It is, and our death is, for instance, met in a violent way, this transition. It is very likely that working through that whole process will put the individual into an equally unpleasant place, where there are interactions with other entities at lower vibratory levels that are problematic, and that the person will have a period of growth that they'll have to go through, and that they will have to evolve, if not within that existence, within the next existence, because he does talk about that this is not the final destination, that there will be potentially other existence beyond this next one that we can see, or that we can have input. What they are exactly, we're not given details, but we know and are assured that it is an evolutionary process. Also know, and he talks about on page 126 through 129, which is really interesting, that there are individuals that are caught almost in an in-between, because of circumstance, because of experience, because of situations either of their making or caught in their making. And it can induce something that is very similar to paranoia, fear. And then the individual acts out of that fear. They get stuck. They fight the transition. They may fight where they need to be and what they need to do, and there are consequences for that. And again, that's explained within the materials. And I really liked them in 136 or 140, the definition that Zane gave in terms of what's our astral hell? Well, it's a result of ignorance and moral disease. One of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes, back in the black and white era of Twilight Zone, one of the Rod Serling originals, was an individual who led a very corrupt, despicable life of hurting others, died. And he awoke in an environment where everything that he wanted was at his fingertips. There was nothing that was denied him. Anything and everything was given to him without cost or without consequence. After a period of 6 months, he began to realize that without the challenges of life, without the withholding of any desire, that creates an environment of torment. And so he was tormented by good, not tormented by bad. And it's out of his ignorance and a moral disease, as Zane describes it from 136 to 140, that individual and others in a similar state, now don't know that they're going to be given everything they want, and that'll be their torment, but that those states of corruption, those states of moral and physical corruption will not be alleviated just because they pass into the next existence. That they will have to continue, if you will, to work out their salvation with fear and trembling. And that salvation is pretty much within their power and within their own hands. Chapter 8, domestic relations. This gets into the practical. You got to have a place to stay. You've got to have the elements of food, of clothing, of existence. And so those things are available to us. We have to work, though. That this won't be to sit back on a cloud and strum your harp. That there will be elements and expectations of duty and service and to others. Now, I really thought it was interesting that clothing is a reflection of your character. You're not going to be naked. It's always the people you don't want to see naked that end up being naked. No, you're going to actually have clothing, but it will be a reflection of who you are as an individual and be very serviceable. Now, I'm not sure I can understand that completely. I'll just accept it as it is. But there'll be an intense period of learning, if you don't know, and then expanding your ability to think and to concentrate. Out of that, your clothing, your appearance, your person will change and grow and evolve. Now, as someone who's been married more than once, there'll be no forced relationships. So if you have prior marriage complications or prior relationship complications, it will filter out as to, because coupling still takes place, pairing still takes place. In what form or format, we don't know, but to know that you're not going to be bound in relationships or stuck in relationships that are destructive, that are not helpful. Transforming energy, and 158 through 160 and on 159, it says, yet quality of energy is only a part of the problem. For to accomplish anything worthwhile in the plane where this energy as used, it must be utilized in volume. And this is where the intensity of thoughts, desires, and aspirations play their part. For it is through mental and emotional intensity that large volumes of energy are taken from the atmosphere in the process analogous to breathing. So men and women, therefore, when the love attraction between them is pure, strong, and unwavering, as when such domestic life as I've described obtains, constitutes a natural dynamo for the generation of energy on the plane where they work, their love enables them to accomplish tasks of multitude without undue fatigue. So the ability to find the basis of relationship that enhance your abilities rather than detract from your abilities will be the norm. It will be the expectation. We may have to be taught how to do that. We may have to be taught and to unlearn habits from our previous physical existence that have blocked us from being able to grow and to prosper in these. Chapter 9 is social contacts and amusements in the next life. We will have the ability to explore other realms, and I think that's very interesting. Not a great deal of explanation, but think about this again within the dimensional context. We are beginning to understand, and has been theorized, that within other vibratory and other rates, that there are those abilities to really make a change and difference. We may not fully understand the hows and whys of this, but yet all of these things do make the change and do provide us with the ability to see other existences and other experience. What those are, can't tell you, not certain, but there's the opportunity we will have to have amusement and distractions and possibly extend our work as well. We'll also have continued contact with acquaintances if we so desire. Some ability, and I thought this was very interesting, and yet I'm not sure I fully understood it, to have communications with Earth, whether that was through a terminal station, I think that was the term that was used on 170, that we could view and be able to monitor. Maybe this is the idea of the guardian angel. Maybe this is the concepts of being able to still have some influence on Earth. Entertainment, work, and play, all talked about. All these things will continue because they're part of our existence and who we are. We also have the ability to participate in initiations and ceremonies. The performance of the sacred continues. Will they be the same as what we experience? And Zane says no. They'll be different, but still be meaningful and powerful in our life. So all these things come. So chapter 10 is probably, if you will, the most important chapter in the book, the most significant. It says what you discover what your work is, your advancement as a person, your development of harmony, and your pairing with in relationships that are mutually beneficial. All of these things really answer, starting on page 187, answer so many questions that people have about, so what am I going to do with myself? What type of existence will I have? How will I continue to improve? Will I be happy? What is happiness? Will I find meaning in my life different than I find meaning here? And the answer is really not really different, just more, maybe more significant. And then, of course, are we immortal? And we are evolving. And I think he kind of left that a little open-ended. Our consciousness continues to exist and expand and evolve. What is the final outcome of that? Oh, no. No clarity is really given in terms of where does this end up, other into the celestial, what he defines as the celestial realm, which has lots of questions in terms of, well, what does that mean? And, it's one of those truthful things that I'm not sure what it means either, that there are just so many opportunities and things to explore and to understand. And it may be we don't get insight into those levels until we get to that next level, that we only have, if you will, a one level forward look. We may, through raising our ability to raise our vibratory rate, gain some additional. But from our perspective here in the physical today, those explanations are seeing in a mirror darkly. We do not have the clarity and the focus to be able to do that. All right, as I said, this is a narrative. This is a summation. This whole book is one that really goes into all of these effects and all of these questions, that the intent that I see is that it is to give us peace of mind. It is to give us assurance and confidence that we continue. And it is to reduce, though it probably will never completely remove, the fear of transition that so many people have. And that is natural and a part of our nature, because we fear what we don't know. Well, here, Zane starts to give us a little bit of understanding to say, but you can know, that you can have some insight, you can have some abilities to better see what is coming down the road and not live in fear, but to live in confidence and to act today preparatory and continue to build on your experiences that will carry forward into the future, that what you do today is not in vain, that to do and to be good to yourself and others continues on into that next life. All right, let me share the closing ritual, and let's discuss this a little bit, because your opinion is as valid as mine, since this was a narrative. It was not something that we were just to ponder upon and to unwrap for ourselves. So if you want to stop the recording.